Hi guys, this is John with the Sacred and Mundane podcast. Josh is out. He had to quarantine. He doesn't have COVID though. He was possibly exposed, and his quarantine's actually almost up, so no worries there. But I wanted to put out some content for you guys, and so this week actually it was kind of spontaneous. This morning I was having a conversation with my wife after having several conversations online, and I was talking about what it means for us to be Christians, specifically Catholics, and that what it means to have that culture and hold that culture. And um, these conversations came about with talking with people that were opposed to Catholicism and Christianity based on some of the things that have happened throughout history. And though we never want to deny those things, they did happen, and it hasn't always been great. It hasn't always been peaceful, and certainly with power, which Christianity had for a long time, comes corruption, and even still to this day we shouldn't deny those things. But I was more concerned with this idea of how it's really easy to see the Pope on Vatican Hill in the Basilica and see this power and symbol of oppression and forget what that stands for. The Vatican Hill stands for that our Pope literally stands on the bones of martyrs, quite literally. Vatican Hill is built on the bones of martyrs, specifically St. Peter was killed there. And so it's easy to forget that the good things Christianity has done, and where it comes from. And this is specifically for people who might be interested in this history, but more or less, like, if you're Catholic, these are things you should be teaching to your kids. So my kids overheard me, and my daughter specifically said, "What do you mean standing on the bones?" And I said, "Oh, they're 6 and 8. My daughter's 6 and my son's 8." And then my son said, "Well, that's kind of creepy, Daddy." And I said, "Hold on. There's a good story here, kids." And so this is what I told him. And I wanted to share it with you guys today. And please feel free to share this and put it out there. I think it's important for people to know this stuff. And it's so important for Christians and Catholics especially to know our history and what is our culture and where it comes from. It's 2,000 years old, and our culture is as important as anybody's. That's not to deny things that have come out of it that have not been good. We need to accept that reality so that we don't repeat mistakes. But, firstly, this is what I told my children. I said, "Do you remember St. Peter?" And they said, "Yeah, St. Peter." I said, St. Peter was told by Jesus that he was the rock. That's what Peter means. It comes from the word Petra, which means rock. And Jesus told Peter that on this rock I will build my church. And then it said that he is given the keys to the kingdom. Peter's given the keys to the kingdom. And then what follows is he says, the gates of hell will not overcome it. And so what Jesus is telling them is that our church will prevail throughout the ages. And so moving forward, we see that Peter denies Christ 3 times. And I talked about that with my kids, and they knew the story. And then I told them, I said, what you may not know is that after Jesus came back, St. Peter was asked 3 times by Jesus, "Do you love me?" Of course, Peter answers yes. By the 3rd time that Jesus asked him, Peter understands and is brought to emotion by the question, because he realizes that he had denied Jesus 3 times, and now 3 times Jesus is reinstating him. And then Jesus essentially prophesizes the death of St. Peter in his older age. in the times that followed, Christians were often persecuted. Um, and I told my kids the stories, so not details, but I told them that Christians were killed for their beliefs, and um, many, many, many men, women, and children were taken to places like the Colosseum. They were crucified like Jesus. I didn't tell them this story, but the Romans would often light the way of the walks at night in Rome and in other major cities with the corpse of Christians. They would burn them on stakes, and it would light the way in the evening. Our history is not always one of power and oppression. There was times in our history that we were the oppressed. This is a hard and difficult history, but it's a beautiful history because our church is built on these things. If you look at the death of St. Peter, for example, tradition holds that Peter is fleeing Rome during the time of Nero. Nero was persecuting Christians like nobody else. It was horrible. And blaming them for burning down Rome when in fact it was likely that he did it. So, of course, Peter's fleeing persecution, and he meets Jesus on the path, the way, and he's told he asks Jesus, Lord, where do you go? And Jesus says, I'm going to be crucified again, which he's meaning Peter's crucifixion. And Peter goes back to Rome, where eventually he is crucified in Nero's circus. Where he died was what we know as Vatican Hill today. And specifically, there's an obelisk that was taken from Egypt in the 30s AD and brought to Rome. And that obelisk still stands today, as it was near St. Peter in the same circus of Nero where Peter was crucified upside down. Peter said, I don't want to be crucified like my Lord. They crucified him upside down. Even today, these stories are important. These early Christian stories, and even St. Peter and many of the early leaders of the church, which we now call Pope, were martyred. And if you go to a Catholic Mass, and it's the long one, and the priest uses the first Eucharistic prayer, you'll see litany of early saints in those prayers, and many of them martyred as well. This is a part of our tradition, and it's sacred and it's beautiful, but it comes from a difficult time. What people don't also understand is that in the Roman Empire, there was horrible things like slavery. They would take babies out to die. If they just weren't unwanted, they couldn't afford them. Many times they were girls, or they were crippled or had issues. And it was the Christians that would go save them. And it was the Christians that denounced slavery. And it was the Christians that didn't participate in the violent gladiatorial games. And by the 4th century, when Christianity became accepted, and by 323 became the state religion, these things passed away from Roman society. By the 5th century, Rome had completely collapsed. The barbarians came in, the Visigoths came in, and Rome collapsed, but not Christianity. This introduces us to the Dark Ages. In the Dark Ages, you have people like Saint Benedict that helped keep and restore old manuscripts that included Greek and Roman philosophy, mathematics, science, literature. Many of these things that we study in our universities today in those fields, we wouldn't have them if it weren't for people like Saint Benedict copying and preserving these manuscripts. Also in the Dark Ages, we begin to move to universities. That was brought forth by Catholicism. Hospitals brought forth by Catholicism. These things are the beautiful things that come out of that storied history. Not to mention the beautiful artwork and art and cathedrals that were built that provided jobs, that provided education, and just a sense of beauty in a time where society was reestablishing itself. By the 1500s, the St. Peter's Basilica that we see now was being built. This is a time of difficulty for Catholicism and Christianity in general, because that's when we have the Reformation. But St. Peter's Basilica is being built, and on top of St. Peter's Basilica, we see this beautiful dome that was put on. Now, keep in mind, we're 1,500 years away from the death of St. Peter. The old basilica was falling into disrepair. The significance of that we wouldn't even know for another 500 years. But by 1942, the church, by an accident, digging a tomb, floor breaks away, exposing the earth beneath it in a graveyard. And as they begin to dig through that, meanwhile, World War II is going on, bombs are falling, and they're, to keep it silent, they didn't even use power tools, so they're digging through this, and they're looking for verification that the Vatican Hill and St. Peter's Basilica was built in the right place, which, to verify that, you would have to find St. Peter's bones. So they dig down far enough, and when they get far enough, they find inscriptions. And one of the inscriptions say that these men are buried with St. Peter. And of course, they find this box of bones placed there. And later studies proved that this was a man in his 60s, first century, and most notably, he had no feet. His ankle and foot bones were gone, which would have been likely if Peter was crucified upside down and they wanted to remove him from that cross quickly, they would have cut him off at the ankles. So this appeared to be the bones of St. Peter. But the beautiful part of that story is that a church that was built 500 years earlier was built exactly on top of those bones. The altar right on top of where St. Peter laid. The dome with that point directly centered above the bones of St. Peter. Later on, a few years back, when St. John Paul II passed away, and there was an election, which eventually brought forth St. Benedict, or Pope Benedict, I apologize. Cardinal Francis George was seen on the papal balcony, waiting for Pope Benedict to come out. And the news had captured him looking over Rome. Later on, the news would ask him what he was doing, and this is what he said. I was gazing toward the Circus Maximus, toward the Palatine Hill, where the Roman empires once resided and reigned and looked down upon the persecution of Christians. And I thought, where are their successors? Where is the successor of Caesar Augustus? Where is the successor of Marcus Aurelius? And finally, who cares? If you want to see the successor of Peter, he's right next to me, smiling and waving at the crowds. You see, hell has not overcome the church. With all the evils that have happened, that even were committed by people of the church, mistakes, sordid history, good popes and bad ones, good priests and bad ones, good bishops and bad ones, good lay people and bad lay people. The successor of St. Peter still reigns on Vatican Hill, on a hill littered with the bones of the early martyrs. And one only has to look at the persecution today in the Middle East of Christians. Look at how they hold Mass in China. You'll find pictures of them holding Mass out on boats so people don't know who they are. There's places in the world today where priests show up to perform Mass. And several people perform Mass with them so they don't know who the priest is, because if they were to find out, the priest would be killed. Our past, our history, our culture, our traditions is not without pain. It is not without opposition, and it's not without oppression in itself. Wherever there is power, wherever there is people, bad things happen. But also good things happen. And I won't deny the evils committed in the name of Christ. But I won't pretend that there wasn't good committed with them. And I won't pretend that Christians in the world have it easy today. Yes, here we have it easy in the USA and in many other Western cultures, but that's not true everywhere. And so we have a right to our culture and a right to our traditions. And I beg you, share these with people. Share these with your kids, your family members. They need to know these stories. After I finished with it and I told my daughter about Cardinal Francis George, my daughter clapped her hands. The story isn't scary. It starts out dark. There's always light. Even in the dark times that we caused as Christians, light can come from that if we allow it. Where there is pain, there's also goodness. Don't be afraid or ashamed of your traditions. And I beg people out there, don't shame us for our faith and our traditions. Ours is a beautiful culture too. Ask us about it. I'm not asking you to believe in it. I'm asking you to understand it before you judge it. Thanks, guys, and I hope you enjoyed this little talk of ours. And we'll see you on the next podcast.